Thank you again for inviting me, and I am very honored that Olana is interested in my story. Olana was very much a part of my history in the past. I grew up in Athens, just across the river from Hudson, and I knew a little bit about Frederick Church when I was growing up. But one of the things that I felt when I was growing up was that I was mostly Italian. I knew a lot about my Italian grandfather who had come from Calabria in the early 19th century. And he found work in the Hudson Valley. And he was still a teenager around 1919 when he came. On my mother's side, we're Dutch, and we're descended from a man named Lambert van Valkenburg, who landed in New Netherland in 1644 in New Amsterdam, today's Manhattan, and then ended up in Fort Orange, which is today's Albany. So this was me. I was a descendant of the Italian immigrant and the Dutch man from Netherlands, and that's all I really knew about my ancestry. And then I felt in a lot of ways that I was the symbol of all that was American, the true melting pot, the just off the boat immigrant and the old Dutch family. So I had a friend many years ago who said to me, if you are descended from Dutch ancestors in the Hudson Valley, they were probably slaveholders. And I remember saying to her, not me, not my family, they were too poor, they were farmers. And she said, just keep looking. So I kept imagining these large slave plantations in the South, and I wasn't imagining the what was true about New York State. So my life changed on the day that I found the will of my five times great grandfather Isaac Collier in 1796. He was 70. He was probably at the end of his life when he wrote this will. His eight surviving children plus grandchildren were scattered around Coxsackie, and he wanted to make sure they were cared for. His wife, Sarah Van Vechten Collier, had died 7 years earlier. His will left nothing to chance. He distributed land, horses, feather beds, wagons. He delineated where his property lines went, who got his farm implements. The will goes on for more than 4 pages and 1,700 words. And then finally, I found the words that changed everything. Detailed like inventory, along with his property lines, were slaves. In a matter of fact way, he distributed a male named Samson to his daughter Hannah, a boy named Will to his son Joel, and a quote, Negro wench named Marie to his granddaughter. Quote, the remains of my Negro slaves, male and female, shall be equally divided, share and share alike. And there's something else about that comment that hit me with a second gut punch. This was exactly where I was born and where I grew up. So I tried to find out more about Isaac Collier, and I became obsessed with the story of slavery in New York. And everyone I asked people if they knew about slavery in the New York. Did you know that Northerners embraced slavery for almost 200 years? Did you know that the Dutch were a big part of slavery in the Hudson Valley? Before this time, I really thought of New York as the home of the abolitionists and the Underground Railroad, and didn't realize anything about the 200 years that had gone before that. But I was beginning to realize that the true history and the imagined narrative are very different. What happened to Marie and Will and Samson? I didn't know what happened to them, but I did find a Facebook group called I've Traced My Enslaved Ancestors and Their Owners. And I joined that group and I posted that I was a journalist doing research on slavery in New York. I didn't say the Hudson Valley. And within 24 hours, I had an email from a woman named Eleanor Meyer who said, I descended from the enslaved people in Coxsackie and New Baltimore. And we realized after we connected that we had something else in common. Eleanor's grandmother had insisted that the Vanderzees, who had lived in New Baltimore, were not enslaved. But when Eleanor looked into her family history, she learned that that was not true. And she discovered this photograph, a woman named Mary Vanderzee, who we consider the matriarch very much of the Vanderzee family, who was born in 1802 to an enslaved couple named Caesar Egbert and Rebecca Dunbar. And Mary Vanderzee was raised in the hoteling family and grew up as, quote, a playmate, and then evolved into the servant of the hoteling family. She was not enslaved, but she was certainly not free. And this photograph was of Mary was taken on her 100th birthday when she lived in New Baltimore. And there was a quote that we found from written in an article written by her about her on her 100th birthday that said, "Her life is a romance. A few years ago, she never tired telling of the changes that she had witnessed. Then the children, I, and the parents would gather around to listen to the tales of long ago, of the soldiers in the War of 1812 passing the farm, her fear of the strange artillery, or of deserters from the army who hid in the barn. Wolves were numerous and fierce. Fire was borrowed from neighbors, and many a bitter winter morning, Aunt Mary, sometimes accompanied by one of her older children, ran with heart and mouth to the frozen brook for water, or across to Grandpa's house for fire." But Mary's childhood ended when she had her first baby. She was about 14 years old, and she had three or four children in her teens. We found records for Sarah, Thomas, and Cato. We don't know who was the father of those children, but we do have oral history that came from Eleanor's grandmother that said that those children were fair with blue eyes. And then when Mary Vanderzee was in her 20s, she married a man named John Van Bergen, and she had two more children with John Van Bergen, Julia Ann and Caesar. We don't know what happened to her first husband, John Van Bergen, but then she married a man named John Vanderzee, and that's where she gets her name, Mary Vanderzee. And she had another son named Anthony. In the meantime, her firstborn children took the name Vanderzee. So Eleanor and I had all this research to do and all of this information to find about the Vanderzee family. And so we did a lot of research on that. Um, One of the things we learned was about slavery and the end of slavery. In 1799, New York State voted to have an end to slavery, but it was very much a gradual manumission. Babies born to enslaved women between July 4th, 1799 and July 4th, 1827, were not considered enslaved, but they were owed a period of servitude, which was 25 years for females and 28 years for males. And what was unusual in our research was that Coxsackie was one of the few towns that kept this record in an incredibly tidy and detailed booklet that is now at the FDR Library in Hyde Park. Those children were born into a period of bondage, even if they were considered free. And in fact, the name of the Coxsackie record of freeborn slaves tells you a little bit of something about the way that the townspeople thought of slavery and freedom at the time. In other words, they were not technically free. They were freeborn. They were not technically enslaved because they were freeborn, but they were also enslaved because they owed service. On that record, which was the account of the birth of 87 babies, of the 46 enslavers named there, I counted at least 17 as my direct ancestors. So that was another very interesting part of my research, and something that I still continue to this day to research. Um, so every time I find a piece of evidence, I realize how important it is to put together these parts of the puzzle. The most profound element of my research has been the connection that I made with Eleanor Meyer, seen here in the turquoise shirt in the photo, and the entire Vanderzee family. And every one of them so far has been descended from Mary's son Thomas, who was a boatman on the Hudson River and lived in Kingston. And what is interesting is that Leigh Fludd-Smith, who is going to be asking me questions in a few minutes, and I just discovered this morning that she is descended from Thomas's son Sylvester, who was one of his many children, and her family married into that family. So we have that Vanderzee diaspora connection as well. Mary Vanderzee was truly a matriarch, and her story does live on. Her descendants include sons and grandsons who served in the Civil War, a descendant who was James Vanderzee, the Harlem Renaissance photographer, and James' father, John, who was a butler to President Ulysses S. Grant. So I'm glad we were able to tell a small part of their stories. The writer Toni Morrison gave me this quote that I think really stuck with me over the years and became kind of the defining message of my book. If you're really alert, then you see the life that exists beyond the life that is on top. And so after I found my family's links to slavery, I felt it was my responsibility to tell that full story. And I really do feel that our inheritance as Americans is to understand that history. And I'll stop there and hope that I can have some good questions from Lisa and start with that. I realize we've just touched on some very brief moments of the story, but I'd love to hear what questions you have, Lisa.
Well, I would like to start by thanking you actually for writing this book and for doing all the research, because as you mentioned, the history of enslavement in New York is pretty much hidden. You know, we didn't really learn about it. We, as Americans, tend to focus on enslavement in the South, and New York was a slaveholding society for hundreds of years. So I thank you for doing this research and for putting it out there. Um, and I guess the first question that I want to ask you is, why did you feel you had to write this book?
That's a good starting question. I felt that this was a story that had been told to some extent, partially, but not fully. There's been, in the last, I would say, 20 years or so, there's been some great scholarship done on slavery in New York State, including like Andrea Mosterman's book, Spaces of Enslavement, Nicole Maskiel's book about slavery in New York. There's been some really great academic writing. What I hadn't seen was the personal and the memoir part of the story. So I felt as if because I am descended personally from slaveholders, that I had more of a sense of responsibility to tell the story in a way that I hoped would reach a larger number of readers. And I felt as if maybe this story, which had been written about very briefly in the past, like if it's mentioned in the history books, it's mentioned in a sort of with a big shrug, like, well, it wasn't that bad, therefore we'll just move on from there. So I felt as if I needed to correct that record also because it was bad. It was slavery. So of course that story had to be expanded.
And that's another aspect, I think, is that people, when people do know about slavery in the North, it's always sort of, it was slavery light. It wasn't really that bad. And slavery is slavery. It is what it is. You know, it's not ever not that bad. Um, do you think why was it important for you to meet someone who was descended from the family that from the family your family enslaved?
That's a funny story because when I first wrote, I wrote an article for the Washington Post magazine about this. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to tell the story of my white ancestors. And then an editor at the Washington Post said, hey, could you find any people who are descended from the enslaved? And I thought, right, good luck. How do I even begin? So I didn't have the idea initially, mostly because I thought it was impossible. And I didn't give enough credit to social media, which can do some really amazing things. So, and then to find a woman who was not only descended from people my family enslaved, but also as interested in the genealogy and the research as I was, felt like a gift from the universe. So it was a nice sort of convergence of serendipity and coincidences and good luck that made me able to do it. But even more importantly than all of that, you know, the white people have all the history books, the big, thick history books. The people who were enslaved, their stories have not been told in the same way. And they deserve the kind of the honor of having that story, their stories told. You know, the stories that we found were just fascinating about their lives and what they had to do to survive. And so I feel as if we've really just touched the tip of the iceberg in some of this. There's so much more to do, but I was glad that we were able at least to start with that. And we often talk about, what would Mary Vanderzee have thought of all of this? What would her reaction have been to all of this? Would she have been shocked? Could she ever have imagined that she would be, a book, have a book dedicated to her because she was such an important matriarch in this family? So
Wow. So what was your first conversation with Eleanor like? Like how do you approach the, oh, by the way, my ancestors owned your ancestors
yeah.
kind of conversation with a total stranger?
Yeah. It was interesting because I actually had tried with someone else before, because I had done a very kind of slipshod ancestry search and thought I found a descendant from another woman, another person my family enslaved, a woman named Nancy Jackson, and did this whole big tripping history into this Jackson family in the Albany area, which is a big family in the Albany area. But I had done a lot of very loose work on that. So a genealogist told me, no, you probably didn't get that right. So she was also not highly interested in engaging with me, and I completely understood that. So when I connected with Eleanor, I felt as if she really wanted to talk. She also told me that she had been rejected and she had been kind of ghosted by a number of people when she reached out and she found out that she was connected to them in some way or another. They didn't necessarily want to talk about it. So we were both hesitant at first, but I think the minute we talked, we realized that we had some very similar things in common. We were not about hand wringing. We were not about woe is me. We really just wanted to do the hard work and tell the stories. And that was the single most important thing for us.
Which actually is a really good, the next question I wanted to ask you, good segue. Um, I'm sure that this brought up all kinds of emotions, variety of emotions for both of you. And I'm wondering if you, as a white person, feel any sort of guilt for what your ancestors did or discomfort about, what that history is.
Yeah. I don't believe in feeling guilt over something my ancestors did. I am not responsible for anyone but myself. So I think the word guilt is a loaded word. I do feel a sense of responsibility, and part of that has to do with my family history, but part of it has to do with my ability as a writer to be able to tell the stories. I mean, if I'm not going to do it, who is? So I do feel as if, yes, there is a bit of a finger on the scale there in terms of being able to do the research, having the time to do the research, and having the ability to tell a story in a way that I hope engages a number of readers. So I don't think that this is about guilt as much as it is about, what is our history? How can we better understand our history as Americans? And if we don't understand this part of our history, or if we don't want to talk about it because it might make people feel bad about that history, then we're missing an opportunity to fully understand who we are.
Right. What would you say to other Americans who have that sort of attitude? Like this is not my family. This is not us.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people are um, hesitant and apprehensive and scared in a way to acknowledge that might be their history as well. So what would you say to other people?
I've had a couple of different sorts of reactions to that. Some people say, well, all of my family were new immigrants, so therefore this has nothing to do with me at all. And I said, well, you are American, so yes, it does have something to do with you. And then some people have said, yes, I do want to research my family history. I do want to know. So some of it had to do with the fact that this has spurred them on to do more research, which I'm glad of. And then some of them have said, yeah, I do have that fact. I know that. I don't know what to do about that, but thank you for making me think about that. I met one woman who wrote a book of poetry about it, which was a wonderful response too. So I think there's a range of reactions, and I can only say that I think it's really important for people to at least have the knowledge, and what they do with that knowledge, whether they teach their children, whether they honor the formerly, the enslaved people who lived in these areas. I think these are all things that we could do.
Great, great. So getting into sort of the more nitty gritty, reading the book, I could tell that you were in all kinds of different places looking at all the research. Where did you go to get to find the research for this book?
Well, first of all, shout out to Vetter Research Library in Coxsackie. That was the source of so much of my research, and I was allowed to go back and page through the archives and find material. And I found research, especially on the Bronk family of Cooksaki, which who were big enslavers, and so I found a lot of research on that. I did a lot of work at the New York State Library in Albany. I found some incredible sources that were not digitized, were not available unless you went and sat in the library. So things like there's a book called The Albany Protocol, which was written by a pastor from Lunenburg, which was then Athens, in which he describes his day-to-day life as a pastor and enslavement. And then there was another book that was also not digitized, or now is only partially digitized, by a Scottish doctor named Alexander Coventry, who lived all up and down the Hudson Valley and lived in Hudson, but traveled all up and down the Hudson Valley in the 18th and 19th century and recorded his life there. And then I did a lot of work online. So Ancestry.com was able to provide me with a number of wills, the census records, things like that. So it's been a variety of things. Newspaper articles, once there were newspapers that had records, were a good source of research. So it was a range of things. And of course, this is such old stuff that it's very hard in some ways to find written records of these things.
Right, right. You mentioned a couple of books that have not been digitized and are in um, the New York State Library or other libraries. Are they available for average people to go, or do you have like a special, because you're a journalist, special access to things?
Oh, no, you can go. They're in the rare books and special manuscripts section of New York State Library. And I think the librarians are also trying to digitize. So part of, for example, Coventry's diary is now digitized, but not all of it. So no, and there are probably things there that I don't even know are there that are, great things to kind of learn about and to find. I'm not done. I'm still writing things. So who knows what else we can find. I think there is no real Rosetta Stone. There's no one single thing that is a key to all of the research, and I wish there was. But I think you can fit together a jigsaw puzzle, and fit the pieces together in a way that is helpful.
If someone were to ask you how to start this work, if they wanted to start it on their own, like what would you say would be the first steps that someone should take?
I mean, if you know your family tree, I would say look at the census records. The census records were very clear on who had enslaved people in their families. And in the beginning, they were just a check mark. And then eventually you would sometimes see names, but you would very rarely see names of enslaved people. You would see names of people who were emancipated after that. But you could put pieces together from that. You could put pieces together from last wills and testaments, which a lot of them are available online. So you can really learn a lot of information just through who was bequeathing what to whom, and what did that say about their wealth. And
Mhm.
then you can trace, the census records also did mark the race of a person. So you could know if this was a Black person living in a town and how large a family they had. And sometimes you could even learn, what they did for a living. So that was useful.
Cool. So one of the things that surprised me when I was reading the book was, as you mentioned in your intro, finding out that Eleanor's Vanderzees had married into my Jimsons, and my family is all from Columbia County on the other side of the river. So I have two questions, two-part question. One was, what were some of the biggest surprises for you that you found out when you were doing this research? And the other is, maybe you could talk a little bit about how the communities could connect with each other, how the sense of movement of
Yeah.
among the communities, that they could actually engage with each other even though they were on the other side of the river.
Right. Well, remember the river froze, and so it was easy when the river was frozen to go back and forth over the river. But also there was this connection between the east and the west sides of the river. People did go back and forth quite a bit. And a lot of times people would even go to church. They would belong to, like, Zion Lutheran Church in Athens had parishioners who were from Claverick. The Van Hosen family came over from Claverick to attend church in Athens, in Lunenburg. So that's kind of interesting. There's a lot of overlap. And for example, Lisa, your Vandersea family did also marry into other families in Columbia County. So
Mhm.
one of Mary Vanderzee's daughters, Sarah, married a Van Allen, and there is a big Black Van Allen family in Columbia County.
Sure.
That's also fascinating. So there was a lot of overlap, and these were small communities. So people all knew each other, and they intermarried, as we talked about before. There was just a lot of overlap in family names.
Yeah. And overlap also among the family names of the white families. And one of the things also that I found interesting in doing my own research is that, like in my family, we have all these Dutch names. We are Van Allens and Van Burens and Van Alstyns. And I think it's a very common idea that there is, a history of miscegenation. And I think it's also important to realize that sometimes you took those names. It doesn't necessarily mean that there was, rape or any kind of illicit relationship between the enslavers and the enslaved. But a lot of times those enslaved would just take those names. And I think that's important to bring out. Um, I did have one other question. In your last chapter, you talk about sort of what people can do to honor this history and repair some of the damage or conflict that's been caused by ignoring this history over the years. And you say that examining your own internal biases is both enlightening and discomforting. And then you say, and I quote, I wonder if writing an entire book on my enslaving ancestors is my incredibly elaborate way of avoiding that discomfort. And I would love if you would expand upon that and talk about how you are reckoning with this history and how maybe other people could reckon with it as well.
Wow. Okay. Yes, you're right. I do feel as if there are lots of ways I've danced around the subject. People ask about the question of reparations and what that means. And, while I do feel that the book is a form of reparations, I also feel as if, yes, there should be financial reparations of some sort. I think that there are also really important ways to bring out, for example, the acknowledgement of who lived here. Connecticut has a project that's now expanding into New York State called the Witness Stone Project, where you put markers of the enslaved and where the enslaved lived. So it's a way for you to say, oh wait, look, I'm here and I see this name, and now I can recognize that person. But you're right. I haven't really directly addressed the whole question of what do I do now? What do I do next? I think I did mention I'm continuing to write things. And so that's part of what I'm doing because I think that's probably the thing I'm best at is writing rather than, writing checks to something, although that's not a terrible thing to do. But I do think I will admit that there is some avoidance of some of the harder questions that I've kind of danced around in my book, and I don't really know the answer. I do think there just should be more of all of this, more understanding, more knowledge, more acceptance of the fact that the Northerners were not necessarily always the good guys. This a lot of Southerners that I talk to are really excited that I'm telling this story because it almost feels as if they now feel a little bit more absolved of something, that they're a little bit off the hook. And I don't think that that's necessarily a great reaction, but I can understand. They'll say to me, "Well, welcome to the club. Now you white Northerners are just as complicit as white Southerners," and I think that's an interesting reaction too. So I am still grappling with it. So I don't know.
Where do you think you're going to go from here? Like what are your next steps? I know you said you're continuing to write. What are your next steps?
Well, I'm writing a scholarly piece on Alexander Coventry, which is because I just wanted to expand on his very complicated relationship with his enslaved people. And how
Mhm.
much, it's interesting how much freedom they had, but at the same time, just how enslaved they still were. So it's a very mixed history, and it's very interesting because at the end of Coventry's life, his children rebel a bit against him and say, "We're not going after Cobus who ran away because we don't believe in slavery, and so you're just going to have to find him yourself." And that was really fascinating to me because you saw this sea change in New York State history. But I'm
Mhm.
also thinking about fiction because one of the things that I had found in my research, and I think anybody who does genealogy finds, is that there are so many gaps, there are so many missing pieces that maybe what needs to be done is a more imaginative approach to some of the people whose stories are lost, and they are kind of haunting me a little bit. So I've been playing around with that a little bit. I don't know
Mhm.
what's going to happen with that because I've never written fiction before. So we'll see. Stay
So
tuned.
it's a brave new world for you to write fiction. Okay. How's your relationship with Eleanor? Like, how has that progressed over the time?
She's one of my best friends. We're really good friends, and we really enjoy talking to each other about things that don't have to do with slavery. We're both Yankee fans, so that helps. But it's also just fun to kind of hang out with her and to spend time with her and her sister and her son, and you know. We have a very normal friendship, which came out of a very weird connection. So I guess in some ways that's kind of a very strange and only in America kind of story. But no, she's
Right. Right.
great. So,
How does she feel about the book? Have
oh,
you asked
she's
her?
she wrote the afterword to the book.
Yeah.
I asked her to co-author the book with me, and she said, "I'm not a writer. I don't want to do it." And I understand that. So I did convince her to write the afterword, which she did a beautiful job with. But she's very happy with it. She's very happy with all of the attention it's getting, and it's a way of honoring her family. And
Mhm.
yes, the
Mhm.
question of am I, as a white person, appropriating her family's story is a legitimate question to ask. But at the same time, I'm trying to expand on that story. And if she wanted to write it herself, I would have been thrilled to do it, to have her, have that chance. But she wasn't
Mhm.
interested. So this was the best compromise that we could figure out.
Yeah, it's a good compromise. I mean, there's so much information about your family and about her family and their conjoined history together. It's really, I found it actually a fascinating book, and I will say that I am very appreciative that it is a book that is written from a personal standpoint, because as you mentioned before, there has been a lot of academic work recently. There have been some really great books by Myra Armstead and Nicole Maskiel and Andrea Mosterman, and Michael Duma has a new book out. So there's really great scholarly work out there, but it's not necessarily accessible to the average person. And I really appreciate that you wrote your book in a way that is accessible for everybody to read and is not like overly academic, but gives so much information. Um, so that's my 2 cents about your
Well,
book.
and
That was
Lisa, I know you're working on a book too, so I just want to encourage you because I would love to hear that story. I would love to hear your family story.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, my book it's coming along.
Well, thank you
Anyway,
both.
this was lovely. I'm so glad I got to talk to you about it. And
Thank
thank
you
you,
both
Carolyn, for
so
having us.
much. Well, we have so many questions coming in, so I wanted to just pop in and, Lisa, if you have any additional questions for Debra, please continue. But we have a litany of questions from the audience that I want to make sure we have ample time to get to. And I
Oh
have some
yeah, there's
questions
many
of
questions in the chat. I can see them. So
I have
run with
a
it.
question I'd love to just start off with, which kind of ties in with what you were saying, Deborah, which is a question for you, Lisa. If you could kind of start us off telling a little bit about your work and the founding of the association that you did in 2021. I think that that's something that I'd love to share more about with the audience with us today. And I also just think it really dovetails nicely with a question that keeps coming up in the chat and that I was thinking a lot about, which is this question about, how do we do this work? How do we do this naming? How do we grapple with what is our history and how we can better understand our history as Americans? And I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you're doing that in your work, Lisa, as well.
Thank you. So one of the things that I always say when I'm talking to people, when I'm face to face with people, is this is not comfortable history
Mm.
for anybody. It is not comfortable for me to say your ancestors own my ancestors, and it is not comfortable for you to say your ancestors own my ancestors. Like, it's not comfortable for anybody. So I approach it from a very no shame, no blame. It's just pure history um, perspective. We started our organization, the African American Archive of Columbia County. It really came out of our family genealogy. My husband is a genealogist, and he did our whole family tree. And we were my mom and I were kind of expecting that, you weren't really going to get that much information. Meanwhile, he has something like 2,000 people now in our tree. And they, on my mom's side of the family, all descended from the original enslaved people in the Hudson Valley, which was a really fascinating discovery for me because, again, you learn about slavery as it's in the South. And when I was a child, you mentioned this also, Deborah, in the book, that Eleanor had the same experience. When I was a child, if I asked my grandmother about our history, they never mentioned slavery. I was told they were indentured servants. And to me, indentured servants is like Irish immigrants, is like what we learned about in school. So I really, I didn't have all of that knowledge about my family. And the more we discovered and the more our tree grew, and then we started finding other people, even who weren't related, it really seemed like we needed to share this information. We needed to put this information out there, both for educational purposes and also to help other genealogists, other families that are looking for their roots, because it is hard work to do. And it's not very well known that the Hudson Valley was a very large, very substantial slave society. So that's why we did this.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that. I think it brings to mind something you shared, Deborah, at the beginning, which is the true history and the imagined narrative can be very different. And having the facts and the information is kind of what can clear our eyes and forge a path forward in many ways. A question that has come up a few times in the chat, which is a heavy one, and so why not get it out of the way, which has come from Alan and Pamela in the chat, is how these conversations and this work might fit into the current climate. What are both of your thoughts on how this might fit into this kind of backlash against including some of these histories, talking about DEI principles, thinking about quote unquote CRT, critical race theory, or woke subjects? I'd be curious to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, I hate all those buzzwords, and they are buzzwords, and they're just kind of like trigger words. What's been interesting to me, though, I can say in all seriousness, is that the reaction to my book has not just come from people on the left of the political spectrum. It has come from people on all ranges of the political spectrum who I think feel, okay, this is history. This is history that we need to know. So I see that as a small sign of hope. I could be completely being oblivious to everything else that's going on, but I don't think this has to do with wokeness or DEI-ness or critical race theory or anything like that. I think this is just telling a fuller story of American history that needs to be told. But I do realize that probably it's not going to be well received in parts of this country in which the whole discussion of slavery is kind of getting shut down. So I think that's a problem. That is a problem. I don't know, Lisa, if you
Yeah,
want
I'm
to.
going to agree with you. I think that those terms have grown into things that have nothing to do with how they started, and are kind of trigger words at this point. I will say that we didn't know how our organization was going to be received when we started this. There's never been a Black History Museum or association in Columbia County, so we really had no idea. And it has been beautifully supported and received. And I think for me, I'm just going to keep going with that. I know that the rest of the world outside is going to have whatever conversations it's going to have, but we have created a community here in the Hudson Valley to share, to learn this information and share it. And I think that's the part of it that we really have to kind of focus on, not what's going on out in the world.
Mm. That's so encouraging, and I think a thread that's also present in your book, Deborah, this kind of what you shared about how, you have best friends forged out of this very, traumatic and difficult part of our shared American history. What our goal can be is community building. I mean, it sounds a little Pollyanna-ish, but hearing Lisa, your response to your work as well, it's very encouraging in that way. Speaking of the African American Archive of Columbia County, where is it, and is it open to the public? That's a question that we've gotten from Wendy.
So right now it is purely online. We do have a website, fmarchivecc.org. We are in the process of finding and hopefully acquiring a physical location, which will include a library, a research center, and a sort of museum area. But that has not quite happened yet. We're still a baby organization. We're still getting the money together.
Well, wonderful. Thanks for sharing. Donna has a wonderful question. As part of your research and writing, Deborah, were you in direct conversation with scholars of enslavement in New York State, historians of African Americans women's history, and if so, what insights did you glean from those conversations, particularly from Black scholars? Any surprises?
I read everything I could possibly read from all scholars, Black scholars, white scholars, and I think that one of the interesting things was that there had been a great deal of work done. It just hadn't been, I don't think, disseminated in quite a way. But yes, no, I mean, I've had much conversation with as many people as I could possibly find. This is a community, and it's an interesting sort of thing to think about. But there is a community of people who care about this subject, and we all know each other, and we all kind of talk on a pretty regular basis. Lisa and I, for example, have gotten involved indirectly and directly in this. There's a Van Hosen house in Claverick in Columbia County that is in bad shape and needs rescue. And so we've been trying to, we think that it's very possible that that house was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And so we're trying to both prove that and then restore the house. And so that's been another area that we find absolutely fascinating. So in terms of scholars, I've read, I don't think there has been any scholar that I haven't read or talked to or connected with in some way. And it's been really an incredible community of like-minded people who really care about getting the history right.
Oh. Two questions have come in a little bit more granular about some of the discoveries or evidence that both of you have found in your research. So one comes in, have either of you found evidence of connections between Native Americans and African Americans as it comes within regards of slavery in the Hudson Valley? Any intersections there? And then another question just about from Emily for Deborah, do you know how your ancestors may have obtained the enslaved people that you mentioned in your initial conversation? Yeah.
I know that there was some intermarriage between formerly enslaved people and Native American people. I haven't had a lot of opportunity to research. One of the people in Eleanor's family, I think her name was Sarah Tunison, who was part of that Vanderzee family, but she was, I think, of Native heritage. And the other question, remind me, the other question was about
how do you know how your family came
oh,
how they became slaveholders? Yeah.
So there were not that many slave markets in the Hudson Valley. Most of the markets were in New York City and some in Albany. So a lot of people were buying and selling from other enslavers. So every piece of research I found was I'm selling this person to this person and that person to that person. So there wasn't a lot of direct evidence of how these people got there. There was a man in Athens, Lunenburg, who was named Peter Christian. He became baptized in the Zion Lutheran Church, who was apparently born in Madagascar and probably kidnapped when he was 12 years old. I would love to know more about how he got to the Hudson Valley. I think it might be through the Phillips family, because the Phillips family in the lower Hudson Valley had slave ships, and so they could have brought him there that way. So these are things that I'd love to know more about, but mostly there weren't those markets that you see, that you could think of when you think of the South. It was more just among each other.
I just want to throw in there too, because you mentioned the Phillips and the selling of enslaved people from one family to another. It's, I think, really important to remember that a lot of these Dutch families were intermarried. So Phillipses were also Schuylers, were also Van Rensselaers, and so we actually have evidence that people were sold, so to speak, from one family member to their cousin in Lunenburg or whatever. So that is actually a lot of how the enslaved people were procured.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. I think it's another example of this kind of, imagined reality of this very violent past versus the truth of it in the northern states like New York. So thank you for sharing that. Another question that we've gotten in the chat is from Nita, who wanted to know, what are the types of resources that both of you have used to gather more detailed information about the lives of enslaved people? I think thinking about scratching the surface and getting some more truth about the reality of these histories, you both have such insight into the lives of these people who, for mostly, I think, are unknown. So what have been the resources and the ways that you've been able to get some more information about the enslaved people's lives? Yeah.
That's tough. Well, one of the things you have to keep in mind is that a lot of the Dutch in the 18th century weren't even literate. So many of them couldn't write, so they weren't keeping journals. And if they were literate, they weren't, highly literate, so they weren't keeping diaries. So a lot of it is extremely hard. It's there are very limited cemeteries, for example. The cemeteries weren't respected, and of course there is the Pine Street African Burial Ground in Kingston that was recently rediscovered, and is sort of that was almost paved over into a parking lot. And there are so many gaps and places to sort of try to figure out what's happened and what's gone on. So I've looked at church records, baptisms, just to even get names. I've looked at, as I said, census records, wills, sometimes newspaper articles. And of course, the most obvious newspaper articles are the advertisements for runaway people who, then you could sometimes find descriptions of the names of people and a little bit of who they were, what languages they spoke, things like that. Not all of them were English speaking. Some of them were Dutch speaking, some of them were Dutch and English speaking. So these are all just tiny pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. And so you sort of go from there. Lisa, did you?
Yeah, that's true. I also find, like, I rely on a lot of the research done by other scholars, and then I'll find a little thread in their work and try and follow that back. Oral history is a big thing for us because we're working, as I said, we started this as a family genealogy thing before we expanded to the whole county. The Hudson Area Library houses the Black Legacy Collection, which is available for anyone to go and see. Back in the 80s, there were videos done of people talking about their families. So one of those things is going through all of the items in their library. And as you said, newspapers and wills. Wills are a lot of what we do. There's a lot of, and also the Dutch Reformed Church records. It requires reading that old script and sometimes reading German or Dutch, but you can find a lot of details in there.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you pointed out some of those resources, and many questions that have come in through the chat and the Q&A for a bibliography of books and other resources. So I might tap you both. We do send an email out after each of our webinars with some further reading. So perhaps we can put something together for those who are tuning into our webinar today. I think something else that I do want to mention is another text, speaking of some of the runaway ads that can be such a valuable source of information. In Defiance by Susan Stetson-Cohn and Ashley Biagini is an amazing resource. So I recommend that to everyone, and perhaps we can add that to our bibliography. A question that I think I'd love for us to maybe close on. I know that we have other questions coming in, so feel free to continue. But one that I think keeps coming up and has been kind of dovetailing throughout the conversation this afternoon is this idea of reckoning with this history and what it means to reckon with this history, whether it's your personal family history or not. I'd love to just add into that conversation, how can historic sites like Olana State Historic Site, like the work that we do here at the Olana Partnership, reckon with this history? What are your recommendations, or what do you want to see from public sites that navigate history in New York State or in the rest of the country? Big question, but
A big
You want to go
question.
first, Lisa?
Thanks a lot. I think for me, from my personal perspective, what I would like to see, and since the question has already been asked about the current climate, political climate, I know that this may get increasingly difficult for people or for sites, but I would like to see the whole history taught in each of those sites. And it is happening a lot, especially in the Hudson Valley, where sites are coming and teaching a more inclusive history. But I think that's the most important part, is to disseminate the information, to teach the whole inclusive history of your sites or of your organizations, but in a way that, again, I'm going to say is a no shame, no blame. This is just pure unvarnished history perspective.
I also want to mention Thomas Cole's site in Catskill has done some amazing work on both the history of the family that Thomas Cole married into, which is the Thompson family, and their history of slavery, which goes down to South America, and also sort of what happened to the free Black people who lived and worked on that site, which has been absolutely incredibly deep research. And some of those people, their stories are still being told, but they're really making some incredible groundbreaking sort of discoveries on that. So that's been an incredible thing to see. And there are other places too. New Paltz, Huguenot Street is starting to acknowledge. I mean, they dot all through the Hudson Valley. Of course, Frederick Church came after slavery. He built Olana after the end of slavery. So he didn't have as direct a connection to his family and to enslavement that the Cole family did. But, there are many, many places that have had that connection.
But I think something that is important to note is the ways in which, the backs of enslavement is kind of how a lot of folks have attained wealth. And I think Gail pointed out historic sites explaining in part and citing where wealth has come from, perhaps if some of that wealth stemmed from slavery. Definitely something to think about. And I think something that, Lisa, to your point, no shame, no blame. It's part of the history, and a part of the history that I think we all can start to jigsaw together to have a deeper and more complete understanding. So thank you both for helping to contribute to that work. I really appreciate you both and joining us for this conversation.